Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in again to The Avid Reader. I don't know why I'm saying tuning in, because you don't tune in really anymore. Just because I'm old. Anyway, today our guest is Milo Beckman, author of Math Without Numbers, published earlier this month by Dutton. He's in love with math. I am not. Milo's work has appeared in the New York Times, Salon, the Huffington Post, Boston Globe, The Economist, and many other periodicals. He is retired, so it says anyway. Math Without Numbers is the perfect book and designed that way for people like me. No nasty formulas, no ugly symbols, no chalk throwing at your head, no sleepless nights preparing for the SATs, no wondering, why will I ever use this? So topology, analysis, algebra, ugh. But no, it's fun, it's exciting, it's funny, it's engaging and accessible, and it's about math. So how is that possible? Well, welcome, Milo, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam. Glad to be here.
So like I was saying, you were about to answer, what's the deal?
What's the deal? Yeah, so I've loved math my whole life, and I think when people hear that, they kind of are confused. I always had this situation growing up where people would be like, "Oh, you're a math kid, right? What's a million and three times 89?" I'm like, I don't know. I don't care. You know, we have calculators these days. And so math, the kind of math that I like, the kind of math that mathematicians study, is kind of not really taught in schools. It's not really most people don't even have access to this. I was very fortunate to sort of come up in this alternate math world. You got math teams, math camps, and stuff like that. And it's really more about just sort of creative problem solving, collaborative thinking, and just sort of working on ideas in the abstract. And, you know, a lot of it's actually really cool and interesting. I think some people are familiar with certain parts of this abstract math world, like, you know, talking about the fourth dimension or different sizes of infinity or things like that. And I think there's this idea, which is kind of pretentious, that you can't understand these things unless you go through this hazing ritual of taking a million math classes and doing a bunch of homework and problem sets and stuff. And I kind of wanted to show with this book that that's not really true. I've actually taught some of this stuff to middle schoolers, to my friends who are artists and couldn't care less about math. And, you know, it's really, it is like, it's fun. It's fun stuff. And the book is very heavily illustrated. So even if you don't really care about learning topology, you can look at the wonderful illustrations by Emma Razzo and sort of get the basic vibe of what's going on in this weird, bizarre math world.
Yeah, the illustrations are great. They're so helpful and something you've never seen before. I always am happy because I always like what Einstein said. He goes like, don't worry about your problems in math. Mine are way worse than yours.
All right.
And so here's my first question. And I don't mind asking it because I think in math, every question you ask kind of leads to something else until you've pretty much talked about all of it.
For sure.
So this question, I don't know why I'm so emotionally attached to it, and I have been for half a century. Why the hell isn't one prime? I mean, it used to be prime. Tell me that.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a math with numbers question. So just to clarify, but yeah. So why one is prime? So first of all, I think it is important to say that you know, it's a game of definitions, right? And when you ask why isn't one prime, that's saying why isn't one prime according to the definition that we've decided to use, right? And so the question is really like, why did we decide to use that definition? Why is it the more useful definition to use? And the basic answer I can give to that is that the purpose of primes in the first place is sort of as like the basic atoms and building blocks of numbers, right? So if you have the number 24, you can break that up into, am I doing this right? 2, 2, 3. See, the numbers is not my favorite part. But anyway, you break it up into its core components. Sorry, it's 2, 2, 2, 3. There we go. And any number can be broken up exactly one way into its primes, right? And so you don't need one in that because multiplying by one doesn't change the number. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer to you, but
yeah, but it's like actually in the book you do talk about one and whether one actually exists.
Right.
And that's like a prime.
Yeah, well, that's like a deeper philosophical question. Is you then get to the point of what is a number, right? What is one in the absence of a descriptor on the end of it? You know what one apple is, or what one pen is, or one day is, but what is one?
What I got wound up with, and you like kind of not lay off, but you kind of say, okay, this is for philosophy people. What I always get hung up on is one is divisible by one and itself. So like and you even get close to that. It's like, is itself one, or is it something inherently something else besides one? Is it self, is it self
Right.
a thing than one?
Right. So yeah, you're talking about the definition of prime where you say it's something that's only divisible by one and itself. And again, like that definition that they teach in school is one of many equivalent definitions that are used in various areas of math. And for whatever reason, that's the one that's worked its way into textbooks. But yeah, the basic idea of primes being just like the building blocks of numbers. And when you're doing multiplication, one is not necessary because it doesn't change the number.
Well, it's funny because you talk about how some of this stuff is just mathematicians not made this up, but it has to be the way it is. And I know if one was prime, then it would mess up all the stuff that you guys have decided, right?
Right. Like for example, what I just said about unique prime factorization, how every number has a unique prime factorization, that wouldn't be true if one was also a prime. For example, the number 9, you could prime factorize it as 3 times 3, or as 3 times 3 times 1, or as 3 times 3 times 1 times 1. And so there's a reason we have to close the door on 1, otherwise we have a bunch of problems there.
The thing that's gotten me in trouble and has been irritating to other people because of your book is that I keep coming up with these phrases like fly away or come here or the book goes on forever or such in time saves 9. So people are getting sick of me doing this because I've been doing it all day. And then I'm thinking, oh, there's a myriad of them. And then I go, oh, wait a minute, what's a myriad?
Yeah.
And so I looked it up. So a myriad is a countless or extremely great number, except in classical history, it was 10,000. So it's like what you're saying. What is a myriad?
Right. And I mean, I think myriad is interesting because one definition of it is literally exactly 10,000, and then another version is just kind of an arbitrary high number. And I think it is, in real life, when you're talking about numbers that are above a certain quantity, you don't like the difference between a million and even a billion to most people does not really make intuitive, comprehensive sense. And some of the stuff that we do in math, especially when it comes to numbers, is really not intuitive for like the way that the human brain works. We're used to thinking of like, okay, small amount, big amount, very big amount. And the idea that numbers like keep stretching off towards infinity, that you have a billion, you also have a trillion, you have a quadrillion, you have a quintillion, right? These are things that are really simply beyond our comprehension. The same is true when you try to talk about like the fourth dimension, the fifth dimension, right? Our brains are not built to think about those. And so one of the fun things about math is sort of the humility, the sort of you have to really humble yourself by just trying to like approach these topics, knowing that you won't be able to understand them, you won't be able to visualize them, but just sort of seeing what can we learn about this stuff that doesn't even exist in our universe.
Yeah, and what you were saying about not being able to be an observer of our world. Some of the reviews have talked about Gödel, Escher, Bach, and Flatland by Abbott. And so you think of Flatland easily because you think of the sphere coming in and being able to look down, have this perspective. And what you're saying is we can't have this perspective of the fourth dimension.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I've never really been able to picture a four-dimensional object. I think, if someone claims that they have, I'd love to talk to them and hear them describe it. But, there are all these tricks that you use in math to sort of make four-dimensional structures sensible, even if you can't picture them visually. And that's something that I talked about in the dimensions chapter of the book, right? Where when we use dimensions, we're not always talking about physical spatial dimensions, right? Sometimes you're talking about like dimensions of politics, right? You have left-right politics. Maybe you can be socially liberal and fiscally conservative, right? Maybe there's two different axes of politics. If you ever take those like online politics quizzes, they put you on a 2D grid. But even that seems like maybe it's not enough, right? Maybe there's a third or a fourth dimension of political ideology that we can throw in there. And even if you can't picture the physical four-dimensional space that you would be located in, you get the idea of what it would mean to sort of have a conceptual four-dimensional space, have these 4 dimensions of ideology, or 5 or 6 or whatever.
Yeah, I know. And what's really funny is I never really thought about how much of what we do, how much of our reality is metaphor. Metaphor for time or number or place in a line.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the quote, I keep thinking of Einstein because he has this quote, well, how can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality?
Exactly. Yeah, no, that is the biggest question mark. And I forget who wrote this, but there's the famous phrase of like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in explaining the natural world. And that's sort of, yeah, that's a topic I talk about at the very end of the book, which is sort of the section that's like, why do we care? What's the point of any of this? And basically, what people should know is that professional mathematicians, they do not care about applications. They're doing this stuff for fun, right? They just want to know what all the manifolds in existence are. They want to categorize all the finite simple groups into these different classes. And for them, it's just like the project of what can we do? What can we discover? What can we learn? And then inevitably, whether it's 20 years later or 200 years later, these discoveries end up creating technologies and real world applications that end up being incredibly useful. So the question is why that happens. And I would argue that it's pretty much an open question, though various people have given potential answers.
Yeah, I know. It's like when I first started, you have shapes, then you have this S1 that you guys decided
Right.
to use, and then manifolds, and then
Yeah.
first thing I thought of was an intake manifold,
Hmm.
in a car, and I go, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense to me, but well, actually, why don't you, instead of me
Yeah.
blabbing, why don't you go back and explain how you go from space to S1 to manifold, at least in the
Sure, sure, sure.
section.
Yeah. So the first section, I start with a leading question in each section just sort of to get the ball rolling. And the leading question in the first section is how many shapes are there? And I love that question because I've done this with like students of all ages and people. It's fun because you just get to start shouting out like circle, star, triangle, and then you're trying to refine it. You're trying to like understand the question. And basically, if you're just asking how many shapes are there, the answer is probably pretty clearly just going to be infinity, right? And that's not a very interesting answer. So people who study topology, which is an area of math that basically has to do with just like spaces and dimensions and anything resembling physical reality, resembling physical space. Um, Topologists do this fun little trick where you basically say, we're just going to break up all the shapes into broad categories. We're not going to care about the difference between a square and a rectangle. In fact, we're not even going to care about the difference between a square and a circle. All of those shapes are just going to be called this like sort of closed loop shape. They're all the same basic structure. You could hold a necklace in a square shape or in a circle shape. Anything that can sort of be stretched or squeezed into each other, we're going to consider to be the same category of shape, the same shape in this sense. And then the question of how many shapes are there becomes way more interesting, right? Then you sort of say, okay, well, we have that closed loop kind of circle shape. What else is there? What else can we even come up with? And if you refine the question one more time, you get to one of the biggest famous open questions in mathematics that is still unsolved. And if anyone figures it out, then they're going to get a Fields medal and probably a hefty prize.
Well, again, like I said, everything leads to everything.
Right.
You said infinity
Yeah.
there once,
Right.
but there's a good portion of the first section, well, the whole book that
Yeah.
deals with the concept of infinity. And
Right.
most people just think of it in kind of like the Twilight Zone fashion, or the
Hmm.
question you asked, infinity plus one,
Yeah.
or Hilbert's Hotel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Actually, the hotel is a great place.
Yeah, yeah. The hotel. So I mean, the one question is there anything bigger than infinity? And can you say maybe is infinity plus one bigger than infinity, right? And I think a lot of like math teachers they give the answer of infinity is not a number. Don't ask that question, which is kind of skirting around the fact that infinity is the central focus of large areas of mathematics. So when you're dealing with calculus, that's all based on the concept of infinity and of things that are infinitesimally small and infinitely big. Analysis, real analysis, and complex analysis, this is all about infinity. So there are answers to these questions. And when you're talking about infinity in a mathematical context, it's the same as if you're talking about a number, right? When you're talking about like the number 8, you're talking about a collection of items. At least that's sort of the origin of where numbers come from. 8 is the size of a set of items. And in the same way, you can describe infinity as a size of a collection of things. It's just an infinitely large collection of things. It's sort of like a bottomless bag, a bag that no matter how many items you take out of it, it still has infinitely many left over. Of course, this can't exist in real life, but it's a concept that we can invent and talk about, sort of like the fourth dimension, fifth dimension. And once again, eventually these things end up having applications in the real world. The example of the hotel, which is a famous example, Hilbert's Hotel, I called it Hotel Infinity in the book, is basically a riddle. So it says, okay, let's say there's a hotel, special hotel, that has infinitely many rooms. There's just one long hallway, and there's just door after door after door after door. No matter how far you go down, there's still another door to go. And on a particular night, it's a busy night, and every single room in the hotel is full. So there's infinitely many people in this world too. And then someone comes in, so there's infinity rooms, infinity people. Someone comes into the lobby and says, I want a room. Can you find a room for me? And so the question is, what do? Do you have to turn them away, or is infinity plus one the same as infinity? And it's kind of a tricky thing. It doesn't really comport with our normal human intuition. We sort of have to get creative. And I'll give a spoiler for that particular version of the question, which is, yes, you can fit them. And what you do is you just get on the loudspeaker and you say, excuse me, pardon the inconvenience. Can the person in room 1 please move down to room 2? Can the person in room 2 move down to room 3? And can everyone in general just move one room further from the lobby than the room you started in? And because there are infinitely many rooms, you're sort of never going to run out of space for the person to go down, and you've cleared up one room at the beginning. So there you have it, an informal proof that infinity plus one is the same as regular infinity.
And we won't go on to how you can make the infinite hotel even infinitely bigger than
right, like an infinity by infinity grid. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the question is there anything that's bigger than infinity? And I won't give the spoiler for that one.
Well, I don't know enough about math to know if I'm giving spoilers, but you do talk about the infinity, which is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 forever, and then the other infinity, which is the continuous infinity, which I forgot the name of. What is the name of it?
Continuum. Your continuous infinity is honestly a more commonly used phrase anyway.
And continuum is cool because it's like everything is infinity.
Right. Right. No, it's really fun. And when you get again, I'm always kind of bothered by the way. I mean, I loved taking all these math classes and learning this stuff, but they kind of make it impenetrable, right? They give you the definition of countable infinity and uncountable or continuous infinity, but you really have to stare at the page for a while and kind of flip back and forth, and you're like, okay, I guess I get it. But then once it finally clicks, it's really fun to think about this sort of idea of a continuous infinity, of how sort of like even on like a finite line, there's a continuous infinity of points. There's like a smooth spectrum of points there. And it's not the same as this sort of like discrete, like but kind of infinity. It's like a more continuous, like shh kind of infinity.
Yeah, which is what happens. And I assume it happens to you at some point too. You aren't able to grasp in your own mind, as you kind of said earlier. You can't grasp these concepts. You can articulate them.
Yeah.
But you can. The way I've always looked at it, I do suck at it, and every report card said Sam does not live up to his potential.
Right.
Which really kind of, that's what I needed therapy for. But, but it's like, I would intuit the right answer, and then they would say, show your work.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't show my work.
Yeah.
It's just...
Because it's just intuitive. No, and I do want to stress this isn't something that's really in the book, but it's something that's I think very important to the world we live in. Is that the math education system? I can really only speak for the United States, but I gather it's a somewhat more widespread issue, at least in the Western world. The math education system is like pretty perfectly designed to turn people off to math. I think the way that math is presented in the first place is like as this hurdle that you need to jump over in order to graduate or in order to get the job that you want. The idea like math is half of what's on the SAT. It's sort of like the main thing that evaluates you on this numerical scale of intelligence. And it's just very intimidating. And yeah, I think there are a lot of really fantastic math teachers. But then there's also a lot of people who sort of take out their own anxiety and inadequacy on their students and call people stupid if they like carry the one wrong or whatever. And it's really damaging. And it's very upsetting to someone like me who really loves math and wish students could sort of get access to this other kind of math that's less sort of about grading yourself and sort of competing.
Yeah, it's like when you are in kindergarten and you're drawing and the teacher says you need to stay within the lines.
Right.
It's like, no, that's exactly what you don't need to do.
Right, exactly. No, and mathematicians never stay in the lines. That's the whole point, right? You build your own lines in math. You set up you get to choose whatever rules you want and then explore that world. That's kind of the idea of it. There's a famous quote from a mathematician. I think it's Janusz Bollier, who said, "Out of nothing, I've created a strange new universe." And I think that's a way better like description of math than what a lot of people get in school.
Yeah, that's kind of what's not scares me, but astounds me is that, okay, you have done that, all you guys. But then,
Right.
like Einstein said, it works perfectly in reality.
Right.
How did you do that? How did you do
It's
that?
how did I do it?
Well,
Uh,
apparently, yes, you
how
did.
did I do thousands of years of math? Well, that's an open question. It's a really important open question, and I think something that makes it. I'll actually make it more puzzling. I'll sort of make it more of a question instead of giving an answer, which is not only why does math do such a good job of describing the natural world, but why did every culture independently come up with math? That's pretty crazy. Counting is one thing. That seems like a pretty natural thing to come up with. But, the same ideas in geometry, relatively the same, have been discovered everywhere. The same concepts in astronomy and sort of using math to predict the motions of the stars, that's happened everywhere. Um, some form of like accounting, some form of irrigation, gambling. These things are all very universal, and they all have this sort of same underlying mathematical language to it. And maybe in one place you do it with hatch marks, in one place you do it with an abacus, in one place you do it with like knots in a string, but it's all this sort of same, they're different ways of speaking the same language. And so that's something that I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and it kind of, we were talking before about the stock market, and it
Mhm.
kind of makes me think about what you said about gambling.
Right.
There's a structure to math, but there's also theoretically an inherent value to it. So, like, suppose you're gambling in a casino and you're sitting there smoking and drinking, and you start with $5 chips and you win, so you move to $25 chips.
Mhm.
The waitress comes by and gives you a drink, and you give her $1 chip.
Mhm.
Then an hour later, you give her a $5 chip. Then you give her a $100 chip, because money has completely lost its value to you during that time period. It no
Right.
longer is what it was when you walked into that door. And
Right.
the same thing is true of the stock market.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, so basically, what is, okay, we were talking about, kind of talking about the structure of it. So, is that intertwined with the value of it, or are they two different things? Kind of, I don't know if that's a good question or not.
Well, no, I mean, I think what I get from that is like the way our economy works is very much built around numbers, and I think that's also part of why numbers and math are very intimidating to people. Um, and in terms of our education system and the way we teach math, I think we have this like twin problem where, first of all, we're not teaching this kind of abstract, fun, thinking, creative math that I really like, but we're also actually not even really teaching this kind of like useful real world survival math, this kind of like numeracy, basic numeracy skills. So sort of, how to do your personal finances, taxes, credit, accounting, the stock market, how to read a graph, how to understand statistics and percentages and make reasoned decisions about evidence. These are all things that I think everyone needs to know in order to survive in our extremely number filled world that we live in. Um, we're not really teaching that, and we're not really teaching this sort of more fun abstract math without numbers stuff. And so yeah, I just hope people are aware that what you're getting in school is not the whole picture.
Which is more fun for you? But like teaching someone how to balance their checkbook, or teaching someone like the kind of magic of all this?
Oh, definitely the latter. I can barely balance my checkbook. And, I think a lot of people who do this kind of abstract math stuff are not that great at some real world things. But yeah, no, I mean, I really like the abstract stuff. I also just like the sort of proof-based thinking of it, just sort of how to reason about evidence. That's something that's been very directly applicable to other areas of life, right? An experience that I would have on math team is if me and one of my teammates had different answers on a question, right? There's sort of this just immediate acknowledgement that only one of us is right, or actually at most one of us is right.
Yeah.
And, I can be very confident in the way that I solved the question and be like, I know that I'm right. I know that I'm right. But at the end of the day, we can only turn in one of these answers. So we need to sit there and hash out, be very humble about the situation, be like, okay, let me try to figure out what I'm wrong about. And I think that sort of same tactic, that sort of same way of thinking logically applies to sort of anytime you have a disagreement with someone or you're trying to solve a problem.
When you said that you have two different answers, it's like your chapter where you talk about, and you do, and the illustrations are great,
Mm,
about the four color theorem, the idea
right.
that,
Yeah.
oh, talk about that. And the other thing is that, when you talk about proofs being beautiful,
Yeah.
No one, no one understands that.
Right.
Where's the aesthetic to that?
It's a great, I mean, that's a pretty long-standing question too, is what is this thing of mathematical beauty? And I think people who study math and who study proofs, there's this sense that like some proofs are extremely elegant or very like simple, and you sort of get this really fascinating result from a clever little trick of the imagination. I think that's sort of the aesthetic there. Um, in terms of the four color theorem, I should say that just the book has it sort of goes over the main sections, main areas of what people consider like higher math or just the math you learn in university and graduate school. But it's sort of interspliced with these little in between the chapters. There's like a page about this, a page about that, some stuff about the moon and the sun, some stuff about like riddles and logic and games. And so one of the little interstitials about the four color theorem, which is one of my favorite theorems in math, and that basically says if you have any map, sort of like a political map of the world, like just regions, any area split up into countries. If you want to color that map so that no neighboring countries are the same color, because that would be confusing, you only need at most four colors, and that's true no matter what map you draw. You can't draw, for example, 5 countries that are all touching each other. And when I first heard that, I was like 8 or 9 or something, and I was like, I'm going to prove it wrong. I don't care that they're calling it a theorem. That can't be true. And I would just like fill pages trying to draw maps that you couldn't color with 4 colors. But it's really fascinating. You actually can't. Like I've tried really hard. So if you take my word for it over the theorem, the proof, that's one thing, but it is really fascinating. It's like, why is that true? Why is it 4 colors? 3 isn't enough. 5 is unnecessary. Why is 4 exactly enough colors to color a map? That is something that's like really fascinating to me.
And with regard to the question, which leads me back to what we were talking about, the first proof that everyone thought was right was beautiful.
Yes.
It's just wrong.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it was wrong. It was wrong. There was this really nice, elegant proof. It's a pen and paper proof, and someone showed it to me once, and I was convinced. And it's this very, very nice way of sort of going through it. It's a little too long for me to do on a podcast interview, but it's this very cute little proof. And at the end, you're like, oh, I see why it's only 4 colors are necessary. And this was proven in, I don't know, somewhere in the 1800s, and it was standing as an official proof, an official theorem for about 11 years, I think. And then someone found a flaw in it. So they didn't disprove the theorem, but they found an error in the proof. They found a case that it was missing, and people tried and tried to patch up that little extra case, but they couldn't do it. And so it went back to being a conjecture instead of a theorem for, I think, over 100 years. And then finally they proved it again with computers pretty recently. But the final proof is like, I think it's over 200 pages long, which to me is totally unsatisfying. I can't understand that. I still don't understand just sort of the gut, like, why is it only 4? And so that's still an open question if anyone can come with a quote unquote hand proof of the 4 color theorem that doesn't involve computers.
The first proof was aesthetically lovely, and
right.
The right proof is not pretty.
No, it's hideous. No, I'm just kidding. But there are a lot of mathematicians who sort of don't like computer proofs. It's sort of not as satisfying as a proof that you can understand in your head.
See, then it sounds like an art, not a science. If it's
very much so. I think that most mathematicians who study quote unquote pure mathematics think of it more as an art than a science. Another famous quote was, I forget which mathematician this was, but one of their students quit math to study poetry, and this mathematician said, "Good, they didn't have enough creativity to be a mathematician." I think that one's funny.
Well, it's so funny because
no shade to poets, though.
I think I'm just going to go around telling people now, instead of arguing with them, like in business, just say QED.
Right.
And you do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, done, and it is done. But explain what QED is.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, QED. So I also wanted this book to just include some of these little like language elements and quirks of math. I actually forgot to do this, but usually at the end of a proof you put a little square in the sort of bottom right corner. I didn't end up doing that in this book, but you do at the end of a proof you say QED in math. You finish a proof, you say QED, and that stands for, it's like a Latin phrase. It's like quod erat demonstratum or demonstrandum or something, and it means like that which was intended to be proved, something along those lines. Basically, it means I proved it. And it's used in math as sort of like the equivalent of a mic drop. You finish your theorem and you're like, A implies B implies C, boom, QED.
Actually, you have a character in your book. Actually, when you do the dialogue, it reminded me of Gödel Escher Bach, where the Achilles and the tortoise, and sometimes the crowd come
in. That was
in.
a reference, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this guy who's like this doubting Thomas,
right?
Trying to tell the other guy, yeah, okay, I get it, but
So, right. So the dialogue, the characters in the dialogue are like genderless abstract objects. But yeah, so basically, there's a point in the book where it gets you get to the point where you're like, you're going too deep into the foundations of logic, and you're like, wait, what the hell's even going on here? And so I wanted to do this as a dialogue. It is a reference to Gödel Escher Bach, but it's also just, I feel like the only way to reasonably do this, because the philosophy of it is very much open. And so you sort of have the main narrative of the book is interrupted, and this other character comes in and is like, wait a minute. Why are you telling me all this stuff? Like, you keep just saying, oh, it's been proven. Oh, it's been proven. Show me. Like, I haven't seen the proofs. Why am I supposed to just believe you and take your word for it? And so the point of that section is to kind of give voice to a lot of these questions that students of mine have had, that friends of mine have had, of just sort of like, why are we so sure about all this stuff, right? Are we just going to trust the person at the front of the room? Are we going to trust whoever wrote this textbook? How do we know math is true? Where does math come from? Is math universal, or is it culturally specific? Does math determine what's true and false in general outside of math? Can we use the same techniques, or is that a load of nonsense? And it sort of goes, a little bit through some of this historical narrative, the philosophical narrative. And as it turns out, there's a lot of different interpretations of what math is and what it means. And so I just sort of wanted to present a couple different philosophical points of view on that, without sort of, leaning too hard towards one side or the other.
You think being doubtful has validity?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think also the point of math in general is to kind of like question assumptions, and sort of like go back to basics, and think very slowly and carefully. And so I think the philosophy of math is really a very central concept in math. And there was a point in like the late 1800s, sort of around the height of imperialism, where there was this idea that math could just sort of be this ultimate objective universal foundation for all knowledge, right? And they tried really hard to make that happen. They tried to reduce all of math down to like 5 different statements, and prove that those 5 statements can just generate all of math, and maybe from there you could generate all of physics, all of chemistry, all of biology, all of psychology, all of sociology, and just the whole world can just sort of come from these axioms, and then everything is objectively true. No one can even disagree anymore. And that project, spoiler alert, it failed pretty catastrophically in 1933, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. But it was basically they proved from within math that it's impossible to create a universal foundation for math that contains all true statements. And maybe that sounds obvious to people who don't study math, but that was a real deal breaker for a lot of people. Some people quit math at that point, and they were like, well, if I can't figure out what's true and false, then there's no point anymore. And some people went on to be writers and philosophers and invent computers and stuff like that.
That goes back to what I was saying about the intuitive part, which also hurts my brain. But it's like Bertrand Russell and Alfred Lord Whitehead, when they wrote Principia Mathematica. And you kind of do it in the book too, where you say, look how hard it is to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. And it took them like 200 pages to figure that out. And then I guess it's Kurt Gödel writes them a letter saying, no, that doesn't work. And I think Bertrand Russell said something like, and that broke my brain for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an argument to be made that the entire project of analytical philosophy, which was more or less started by Bertrand Russell and his friends, was kind of part of this mission to objectivize, sort of make absolute and non-subjective all aspects of human life. And for me at least, Kurt Gödel and that proof that broke me. They don't tell you about that for maybe for obvious reasons, but when I sort of first found out about that proof, I was like, wait a minute, what? And I read Gödel, Escher, Bach, and there's a lot to think about there, if you're one of these hardcore mathematicians. But I also just wanted to sort of present that narrative and that dialogue to people who may not be familiar with that historical story.
And like I said about leading into everything else, this leads into your concept of sets. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about, the set of 3 things, the set of sets, the set,
right.
set of sets, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So in there's an area of math where you just kind of try to talk about all these different abstract structures. And it sounds very confusing and difficult. And I will say, full disclosure, I did a much better job with it in the book that I'm going to do right now, trying to explain it. So if it sounds very absurd and confusing, there's more room to sort of build your way into it. But yeah, you think about the structure of something like a social network, right? Something like Facebook, where you have these dots that represent people, and you can draw a line between two dots if they're friends with each other. And so that's a particular kind of structure called a graph. I think most people intuitively think of that as a network, but in math you call that a graph, where you just have nodes and you have edges that are connecting the nodes. That's one kind of mathematical structure. An alternate version is something like on Twitter or Instagram. You have sort of one-way connections. You have this concept of following, where instead of having people have to be friends with each other, you have like an arrow instead of a line. So you have dots and then arrows connecting them. And there's a bunch of different structures you can make like that that are useful in all different kinds of contexts. And the very most basic structure of all is just a set. And that's just a collection of dots that have no connections between them. It's just a collection of dots. So the most basic set would be a set of 1 items. And that's just the number 1, basically. A set of 2 items, a set of 3 items. And so sets are very easy to classify in that way. At least finite sets are very easy to classify in that way, because that's really all they are, is a quantity. But there are other kinds of structures that get more complicated from there.
And it's good that you stop some places in the book, because otherwise your book would be like an infinite number of pages.
Right.
But like, if you do talk about, just because these are things I've thought about, that's the only reason I'm asking, although we should be trying to sell your book.
Right.
Like, so if you take the set of all sets,
yeah,
and the paradox, does it include itself? If it does, then, that thing. I mean, those are the kind of things, or like Zeno's paradox of the arrow,
right.
It'll never reach its target because it's only going half. Those are the places where this all breaks down. Mm-hmm. Those are the places where you can't translate it into reality. So if you're going to talk about one paradox, since we're talking about sets, talk about that concept of the set of all sets.
The set of all sets. Yeah, so that's Russell's paradox. The very same Bertrand Russell, who tried to make everything into axioms. And basically the idea was, okay, if you have this concept of sets, what is the set of all sets, right? Can you have something like the set of all sets? And you have to be very careful with how you define these things, because then, okay, here's the paradox. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. What about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, right? So the set of all sets which do not contain themselves. Well, is that set contained in itself? If it is, then it's a set that does contain itself, so it should not be in the set. But in that case, it's a set that doesn't contain itself, so it should be in the set. And so that was a paradox that showed sort of early on in the development of set theory that we had to be very careful with definitions, and you couldn't just let people define sets willy-nilly. You had to have sort of a more rigorous foundation for it. But yeah, as you said, I sort of had to just do kind of a greatest hits collection in this book, because I wanted it to be short and sort of an easy like beach read, bedside table read. And so Russell's paradox is not in there. I don't think Zeno's paradox is in there either.
Yeah, and now I can almost tell where you stop. I can almost see you thinking, okay, well, let's just draw the line here.
Yeah, I want people to be like a little bit thirsty for more, where you get to the end of the book and you're like, maybe I do want to read a little bit more math.
Well, that is it's so obviously it's really cool, because if you're reading this on your iPad or your Kindle, you just touch the word, whether it's integer or interval or whatever, and then you find out.
Pop up Wikipedia. Yeah, Wikipedia has pretty good documentation of some math stuff, though I will say they sometimes, for something like a manifold or anything that's a little bit quote unquote more advanced, they often just define it in terms of other things that are equally incomprehensible. So like the other day, I was reaching out to this mathematician Yao Xing Tang to get him to try to read my book, and I was like researching what he's worked on, and I was trying, and one of his big discoveries is Calabi-Yau manifolds. And I was like, great, let me find out what a Calabi-Yau manifold is. I click on it and it's like defined in terms of this like whatever Grothendieck metric, and you just keep clicking and you're like, never mind, I need to take a class if I'm going to do this.
Right. It's like if you say, what's this animal with a long neck? It says, the dictionary says sea giraffe, and then giraffe describes it as a long neck.
Exactly.
Or like Woody Allen, because I was thinking of modus ponens just because I remembered it from college. And so then I looked at what Woody Allen said, which is, all men are mortal, Socrates was mortal, therefore all men are Socrates.
Right.
So it's like, at first these things, the axioms or the syllogisms, because then I found out about syllogisms, are like, okay, yeah, they make perfect sense, but then wait a minute, there's something, it doesn't
Yeah.
quite
Yeah,
work.
human brains are very easily foolable, right? Like it's easy for something to sound logical and sort of feel logical and then not actually make any sense at all. And so I think one of the if you want to describe what the purpose of just sort of mathematical reasoning in general is kind of trying to work out, absent of our own psychology and how our brains work, what is an acceptable conclusion to make from evidence, or what are sort of logical patterns of thought that lead you from one true statement about the world to another true statement about the world? And that's not just an abstract question. That's something that's very relevant to the way the world works, right? How can you take your knowledge of the world and sort of shake it around in your head and generate new knowledge about the world? That's a pretty magical thing.
Oh yeah, inference.
Inference, yeah.
Yeah. So
Logical
we'll talk a
inference.
little about, okay, see, look, it has led up to everything, right?
Great, we're bouncing around every chapter in the book. Yeah, so the question, and this kind of leads into the dialogue, but sort of what is the nature of inference, of sort of logical inference, of how can you take, basically what I was just talking about, how can you take knowledge about the world and use that to generate other knowledge about the world? For example, if you find out that sea levels are rising, right, then you might conclude from there, okay, people who live near the coasts are in danger of displacement in the next 30 years. That's an inference that you make based on your understanding of the world and a piece of evidence that then leads you to a conclusion. And so one of the questions in math is sort of like, what are acceptable inferences to make? What are like these patterns of inference that will never lead you astray, never lead you to faulty conclusions if you apply them correctly?
Yeah, I know. And then when I looked it up, unfortunately, I got into deduction and induction,
Mm-hmm.
and then I sort of got lost. I went down one and then the
Right.
other. I was like, then I got mad at you again.
So sorry. At least there's some pretty pictures to
Yeah, I know.
ease the pain.
If I hadn't read it, but if I just looked at the pictures, I would have
Right.
been off.
That's
Actually,
I'm hoping some people will just read the picture, read the pictures, look at the pictures.
yeah, it's well, and I'm not going to get political, but if you look at the last 4 years, for example, or
Yeah.
5 years, or whatever, it's easy to have this knee-jerk response that I'm right. I mean, I know the other side. What the hell are they thinking? Where did
Yeah.
they come up with this stuff? And then the other part of me is like, try to look at it from their point of view. It's almost impossible for me to do that.
Right.
But if I could do that, or the view of a fundamentalist Christian or something like that, if I could look at it, it's exactly like what you're talking about. It's like,
Yeah, or the view of like a garment worker on strike in India, right? That's the other thing about it is like there's more than just one, and there's certainly more than just two perspectives on any of these things. And sort of like, yeah, the approach, I don't know if this is particularly mathematical, but just the approach of sort of saying like, I'm building my entire worldview on this particular framework, on this sort of set of, we can call them axioms of my understanding of the world, and other people have very different ways of looking at it, whether it's a religious viewpoint or a scientific viewpoint or a ethical viewpoint. People found their ideologies on any number of different things, and it's just important to sort of be able to take all those models of reality in mind.
it's funny because you kind of do that in the book, and I'm wondering, okay, well, like when you talk about the three-dimensionality of personality,
Right.
or even taking people out of it, the three-dimensionality of color. And then you
Yeah.
show the color wheel and the different, and again, the illustration there is really good.
Yeah. Mhm.
I think you have three different ways of looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so all these things, again, you think about it and you go, I never really thought that this was connected to what he's writing his book about. And it
Exactly.
is.
Yeah,
But
no, and that's what I wanted to do, is sort of bring all these things together in terms of like the dimensionality of color. If you ever used like a color picker tool on like a illustration software or something, you probably have noticed that maybe you didn't frame it this way, but color is in some sense three-dimensional. They give it to you as like RGB or as like hue, saturation, brightness, or you just have that two-dimensional color disk, that kind of circle, and then a brightness slider. But however you try to slice it, you need 3 dimensions to pick out a color. And that to me is kind of bizarre.
which now leads me into the fourth dimension,
Yeah.
because in the beginning, you say you don't know what the fourth dimension is, so you call it what, flim flam?
Right. I mean, when you're talking about like physical dimensions, you're just like, okay, there's up, down, left, right, forward, back, and then a new one, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't exist in the real world. So.
But then later on, you talk about it as if it really is time, and there really is a space-time continuum, and the time is the fourth dimension. So are you saying time is the fourth dimension, or mathematically speaking, there's a different fourth dimension? Oh yeah, I remember that story by Robert Heinlein. It was called "And He Built a Crooked House," where the guy builds a tesseract in the middle in San Francisco, and in the middle of the night there's an earthquake and it folds in on itself. And then the guy looks out each window and he sees a different universe outside of each window.
I haven't heard of that one.
So really
cool.
It's a good story. But yeah, so
yeah, I think the idea is that these concepts are very applicable to a bunch of different areas. So when you're talking about pure mathematics, when you're talking about dimensions, you are just kind of talking about these non-existent extra physical dimensions, like a four-dimensional object that's like, a cube, but then another layer of cube or something. When you're talking about physics, though, when you're applying math to physics, yeah, a lot of people use a four-dimensional model of reality that has three spatial dimensions and one time dimension. And so that's another application of the fourth dimension. But also, yeah, if you're talking about color spaces or, yeah, as you said, personality metrics. One of the most common measures of personality that's used by academics and by like advertisers and stuff to sort of like target products is this five-dimensional model of personality called the Big Five or ocean metrics. So it gives you you can grade people along these five different axes. You have like extroversion, you have like conscientiousness, openness to new experiences. I forget what the other ones are, but you get the idea.
Yeah, I know. It's like when you're talking, well, first, I guess a more primitive view of ocean is what you talk about is Myers-Briggs.
Right.
The thing that bothered me when I took that, sometimes they'll ask the question like 6 different ways.
Yeah.
To shape you, to give you your right shape.
Right.
And I think there was something, I might be dreaming this, but there was something like when you walk by like a kitchen counter and there's a knife there, what do you think you want to do with it? And I immediately thought I wanted to stab someone. I think Larry
like a 0 on conscientiousness or something. Yeah, I mean those tests are always funny because you can tell exactly what they're going for, right? You get a question that's like, would you rather be at home reading a book, listening to Chopin, or at the club dancing and doing drugs with your friends? It's like, I wonder how this is going to place me on this scale.
I know it's a great test for a sociopath, Right. Yeah. It would be really hard to take that test and be defined as a sociopath. That's a mathematical thing right there. If you are a sociopath and you take the Myers-Briggs, would you be then classified as a sociopath?
I don't know. I don't know what definition of sociopath we're using here. But yeah, no, I mean, what I really love about all these questions also is that it's very clear that like these concepts from the book have like wormed their way into your brain. And that's exactly what I'm hoping for with this book is people who are math phobes or didn't give that much attention to math will at least get access to some of these terms and be able to sort of like see the world through that lens. So that's the hope.
Did you ever see the book, The Number Devil?
I did. I loved that book growing up. That was like one of, I think it's a really good one for kids.
But it's harder than yours.
I don't remember that much about it, but yeah, it definitely has like factorials and stuff in it. It definitely is a little bit more numerical for sure. The Number Devil.
Yeah. Do you know the author Rudy Rucker?
I don't. No.
You should read Rudy Rucker's book because one of his books deals with Hilbert's Hotel. But
yeah, I would love to. I really liked that book.
Yeah, he wrote the wetware tetralogy, so it's software, wetware. Yeah, there's a whole bunch.
Yeah, very cool.
Rudolf von Bittner Rucker.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. Well, so if what you're saying about me gets recursive, which is another mathematical, right?
Yeah.
Recursion is, right?
Recursive, yeah.
Yeah. So now we're talking about recursion and me though, which is kind of also irritating. Now I can't
take it easy, drink some water, do some breathing.
Yeah, I need to calm down. I'm getting all excited about it. Which is again what you want. But yeah, so I have this independent bookstore and this book's got on the front table and it's got a great. Do you have one you can hold up? With you?
Yeah, I do. Here, it has a Post-it in it, but you can ignore that.
Yeah, it's a great cover, and I always say this in interviews, but as many times as you hear
illustrations.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But as many times as you hear, and that's what people will do. And they'll
Right.
go, oh, I can do this.
Yeah.
But as many times as you hear people say, don't judge a book by its cover, every single person that comes in the bookstore, without
They
exception.
do. It's just the way the world works. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I should ask you, did you design the cover? Because publishers usually don't let the authors because they want the book to sell. So they design the cover.
I did a mock-up of this cover, but I did not do the actual illustration. But yeah, I wanted to do just like lowercase big title on a kind of weird like tie-dye background and like have some kind of mathematical shape there. So the overall appearance was my sketch, but then they had an artist in-house do it.
And also, yeah, the cover also goes along with, I was really entranced because then all of a sudden there's these page after pages of how to draw, do a decadron. And yeah, how did you come about doing that? And it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that particular thing I learned at math camp. I took a class on polytopes because that's what you do at math camp. And one of the days it was just like, let's just learn how to draw all the regular polyhedra. And I really loved learning how to draw a dodecahedron, icosahedron, and that's like one of the things that I always doodle when I'm bored in class or something. I'll just like draw these shapes. And so yeah, I just wanted to show people that. Again, it's just kind of trying to be like a greatest hits collection from my weird, extravagant math education. And that's one thing that people have seen me doing. And they're like, wait, I want to know how to draw that shape. And so I put it into the book between two chapters.
Yeah, you see little videos of that on YouTube or TikTok,
Right.
people doing that. So what happens at math camp? Do you get to go canoeing and swimming and stuff?
Not so much. It's actually mostly just a lot of math. Maybe play some frisbee on the side, but it's whatever. I think of it like very similar to like band camp or something. It's just a place where young people who are obsessed with the same thing get to sort of come together uh, and be friends. It is centered around like friendship and collaboration, and I think that's really fun because I think generally in our society, math is about competition and individualism. So math camp sort of gives you an alternative to that. Though they are pretty exclusive and there are culture problems there for sure. But I think, I'm really grateful for the education that I got at math camps and on math team.
Well, since you say it that way, do you think because of, I'm going to call it an obsession. It's not an obsession. Again, I don't know. Is it an obsession?
Math?
With you.
Oh, for me, yeah. I mean, definitely for most of my life, it has been. Yeah. And I sort of started branching out a little bit more when I was in undergrad, and I sort of finished most of my math education that's presented in this book by the time I was like 16 or 17 or something. So I've had a couple years to cool off and sort of do some other stuff before circling back. But yeah, I was definitely obsessed. It was definitely something that took up most of my time.
Well, so that leads to my next question. Do you think that you lost anything?
Lost anything
I
by
mean, you know what I mean?
yeah.
You
Like,
think
I'm not going to get a Fields Medal anymore because I wasted my time communicating math to to young people and people who don't care about math. I don't feel. I mean, I don't know if I was going to get a Fields Medal anyway. Let's put it that way. I wasn't like on track. I wasn't like trying to do a PhD in math right away. I'm sort of interested in a bunch of different areas and subjects. I'm really grateful for sort of all of these mathematical concepts that are presented in this book and sort of the way that they've helped me understand the world more generally. Right now, I've been studying, I just went back to grad school for the philosophy of physics, philosophical foundations of physics. And that is something where having this math knowledge, like just understanding this language and these tools is extremely useful and sort of helps me understand that more. So, I do know that there are people who sort of, when I started branching out from pure mathematics, they were kind of like, damn, we lost one, could have gotten some great theorems out of him or something. But I guess I don't take it too personally. My hope is that by writing a book like this, I can also influence more people to sort of come into the fold in that pure math world. And maybe one of them will get a Fields Medal eventually. So.
All right. Well, stepping out of that, because that wasn't really where my question was going.
Okay.
About like relationships or avocations. Learning how to make wine at home or something like that. I mean,
yeah. Well, again, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think it also has to do with like your upbringing. I think a lot of people have things that eat up their time, whether it's just like a hour and 45 commute both ways to school, that takes up a lot of time. And I've been very fortunate in a lot of other ways to sort of had a lot of the basics of life kind of accounted for and sort of has given me time to sort of just do free form math stuff and other like writing and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like I've missed out on too much, but other people prioritize their life differently, and everyone has their own life.
Well, so, all right. So the graduate work is the philosophical foundations. What is it?
Yeah, Philosophical Foundations of Physics is the name of the program, and it's a joint program between the philosophy department and physics department.
See, that's another one. I can kind of understand it, but I couldn't explain it.
Well, yeah, I mean the very basic version of it is kind of like trying to apply there's kind of two sides to it. Trying to apply what we now know about the physical world through empirical evidence and research and sort of use that to try to tackle some of these big fundamental philosophical questions. So, you might say like, oh, if we're all just made out of particles and, if my perception of reality is constructed inside my brain, then okay, what does that mean? What are we doing here? Right? Like, what's the point of this? What does it mean to be a moral person in the world? It's something like that. And then the other side of it is if you kind of go too deep into quantum physics, there are these questions that pop up. Anyone who's familiar with like the double slit experiment or Schrodinger's cat or anything like that is aware that there are some very strange questions that pop up of sort of like, is the future determined by the present? What sort of counts as an observation? Does observation actually affect reality? Does sort of our partaking in the act of observation create an influence on the world we're observing? Questions like that come up. And so, there's a lot of interesting stuff to think about there.
Yeah, like the anthropic principle or
Yeah, for sure.
Heisenberg's.
Right. Why does this world have gravity and electromagnetism and then two other weird nuclear forces? Like that seems very arbitrary. Why is gravity as strong as it is and not like 3% stronger? That's all seems pretty random.
Also, why doesn't ice sink? I mean, that's
right. That's a really weird one. Yeah, water is like the weirdest substance of all.
I know if it sunk, that would have been it.
I actually have a bookmark on my browser right now that links to this website that's just called what is it called? Anomalous properties of water.
Yeah.
And they just have like 60 different like reasons why water is extremely bizarre compared to every other liquid, and it makes no sense that it should be that way.
I know. And you can talk about silicone-based life forms. All this leads everywhere, It's just like so weird.
Yeah, math is at least the way I see it, math is a foundation for most areas of thought. At least this kind of math is sort of like way of thinking about the world is useful in a lot of places.
Yeah. There was something else I was going to say about that. Oh, I know what it was. For some reason, I've been interviewing these authors over and over again who've written books about consciousness.
Yeah.
And the basis for consciousness. And each time I ask them, what if it's a solipsistic universe? And they all get pissed off at me.
And then they close the chat. Yeah.
Because if it is, then one of us isn't talking to the other, but I don't know which one it is.
Right,
and
exactly.
It screws up their whole book because it would be meaningless.
Right. Solipsists don't usually write books, I guess.
I don't know what they do. Well, it wouldn't make any difference because it would make a difference.
They would just be for themselves, yeah.
So anyway, well, I could do this all day, but this has been an hour exactly in 17 seconds.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And there it is. There's the math. What is an hour and 22 seconds? And you talk about that too, right?
Fine.
I mean, yeah, I just slapped 5 numbers on where and what I am.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we done? Should we be done now?
I guess so. Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Yeah. Thanks.
It was. I really enjoyed it. And it really is like, okay, so to plug it, really is a great book. And it's not like, okay, could I put one copy of this in the young adult section?
Totally. Please do. Yeah.
I did, but then I thought, well, wait a minute. Is it young adult? Is it nonfiction? Is it science?
Is it science fiction? Is it fantasy?
Yeah, so you're genre bending, which is a new thing now. Yeah, so it's out there. It's out there in 2 or 3 places. So
yeah.
And Oh, and my daughter, who works at the bookstore sometimes,
Yeah.
she does this thing. No one else does it, and they get pissed off when I praise her. But she'll come out from behind the counter. She'll grab your book. She's done it before. She'll grab your book, and she'll go up to someone and she'll say, "You have to buy this."
Wow.
They buy it.
I'm so glad.
It's so cool.
That's so
But,
great. Yeah, I hope it spreads by word of mouth. I hope people have fun with it. I'm hopeful there's little riddles in it and people keep emailing me being like, please, I'm driving myself crazy. What's the answer to the riddle with the 3 doors? So I hope people find the answers that they're looking for.
yeah, it's like my daughter that I was just talking about is downstairs right now Zooming her class on AP physics.
Uh-huh.
And I went by the screen and I was like, no, I can't look at this.
Yeah.
I can't look at it. I don't understand it. I don't begin. Of course, she's going, what am I going to do this for? Why am I doing this?
Right.
How will I use this?
Yeah, it's a rough time for education.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thanks so much. I really appreciated this today, Milo. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on your show.
You're welcome. Talk to you soon.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.